Would you believe me if I told you I was an atheist who ridiculed students for wearing religious symbols in my classroom? Would you think I'm making up stories if I shared how I confiscated rosaries from my students, calling them superstitious nonsense? What if I revealed that my entire worldview changed because of a 17-year-old boy who appeared in my classroom months after his death? My name is Sofia Ricci. I'm 43 years old, and for 18 years I taught literature and philosophy at Liceo Classico Alessandro Manzoni in Milan, Italy. I was known among faculty and students as the militant atheist, the hard-headed rationalist who had no patience for religious sentiment. I was proud of my reputation, wearing it like a badge of honor in what I considered my personal crusade against superstition in an enlightened, scientific age. If you're watching this video right now, I'd love to know where you're joining us from. Take a moment to share your location in the comments and consider subscribing to our channel if stories of extraordinary spiritual encounters resonate with you. What I'm about to share has been my closely guarded secret for nearly 5 years. I've never spoken publicly about it, fearing the judgment of my academic colleagues and the scientific community I so desperately wanted to impress. But today, I can no longer remain silent. What happened in Classroom 3B on November 21, 2018, defies every rational explanation I had built my identity around and transformed me from a bitter skeptic to someone who now recognizes dimensions of reality that transcend our limited understanding. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The November rain pounded against the windows of my classroom as my third-year students worked silently on their essays analyzing Nietzsche's death of God concept, a topic I had deliberately chosen, as I did every year, to challenge what I considered their naive religious beliefs. The clock showed 2:37 p.m. when there was a knock at the classroom door. Irritated by the interruption, I called out sharply, "Enter!" The door opened, but no one came in. Thinking it was students playing pranks, I marched toward the door, prepared to issue detention slips. But when I looked into the empty corridor, something peculiar happened. The air suddenly felt different, lighter, almost electric. A subtle fragrance that I couldn't identify filled the space. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a silhouette in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing. Dismissing the strange sensation, I returned to my desk, annoyed and slightly unsettled. That's when I noticed him, a student I had never seen before, sitting in the empty desk in the back row by the window. He wore a simple grey hoodie and jeans, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he had been caught in the rain. His presence was strange, not only because I hadn't seen him enter, but because I prided myself on memorizing all my students' names and faces on the first day, and this face was unfamiliar. "Excuse me," I said sharply. "Are you supposed to be in this class?" The boy looked up and smiled, a smile so genuine, so peaceful that it momentarily disarmed my usual stern demeanor. "Yes, Professor Ricci," he replied in a soft but clear voice. "I'm supposed to be exactly here today." Something about the confidence in his answer puzzled me, but with 27 other students waiting, I didn't have time to investigate. "What's your name?" I asked, reaching for my attendance sheet. "Carlo," he replied simply. "Carlo Acutis." I scanned my roster. No Carlo Acutis appeared on my list. "Are you a transfer student?" I questioned, growing increasingly impatient. He smiled again, that same serene smile. "In a way, yes. I've transferred from one reality to another." Several students chuckled, and I shot them a stern glance. I assumed he was trying to be clever. "See me after class," I said curtly. Returning to my desk, I would sort out this administrative mix-up later. As I continued my lecture on Nietzsche's philosophy, criticizing religion as the opiate of the masses, and praising rational thought as the only path to truth, I noticed that this Carlo was listening with unusual intensity, not with the defensive posture of my religious students who felt their faith under attack. nor with the smug agreement of those who shared my atheism. He listened with a compassionate interest that was frankly disconcerting. Periodically, as I made my most pointed arguments against faith, our eyes would meet, and instead of the confrontation I expected, I saw only patience and what seemed like understanding. The class was nearing its end when something happened that would begin my unraveling. Gabriella Esposito, a quiet girl who sat in the front row, had placed a small rosary on her desk, a direct violation of my infamous no religious symbols policy. I had implemented this rule years ago under the guise of maintaining secular education, but if I'm honest, it was part of my personal vendetta against religion. Seeing the rosary, I felt the familiar surge of righteous indignation. "Signorina Esposito," I said coldly, approaching her desk, "you know the rules. Hand it over." Gabriella's eyes filled with tears as she clutched the rosary. "Please, Professor Ricci," she whispered. "It was my grandmother's. She died last week. And carrying it makes me feel—" "Rules are rules," I interrupted, extending my hand. "Your emotional attachment to this object doesn't exempt you from classroom policy." Just as Gabriella reluctantly began to place the rosary in my palm, a voice from the back of the room stopped us both. "Professor," Carlo said, his voice somehow filling the room despite its gentleness, "may I ask why this rosary bothers you so much?" The classroom fell completely silent. No student had ever challenged this policy. "It's a distraction," I replied automatically, though the words suddenly sounded hollow even to me. Carlo nodded thoughtfully. "What if it's the opposite? What if it's actually helping her focus today, when her heart is heavy with grief?" I felt an unexpected flush of embarrassment. "This isn't a debate, young man. In my classroom—" Carlo interrupted me with a question that hit me like a physical blow. "Is it possible that what truly bothers you isn't the rosary itself, but what it represents? Not the distraction it causes others, but the distraction it causes within you?" In that moment, it felt as if no one else was in the room. His words pierced through decades of intellectual armor, touching something buried so deep I had forgotten it existed. How could this boy I'd just met see through me with such clarity? Before I could formulate a response, the bell rang. Students quickly gathered their belongings, eager to escape the unusual tension in the classroom. "Everyone dismissed," I said weakly. "Except you," I added, pointing to Carlo. "We need to sort out your enrollment." As the last student filed out, I turned to the back of the room where Carlo had been sitting, but his desk was empty. I looked around, confused. There was no way he could have left without passing by me at the door. "Carlo?" I called out, moving between the rows of desks. No answer. A chill ran through me as I approached the desk where he had been sitting just moments ago. The surface was completely clean, with no sign that anyone had used it that day. But there, on the chair, was a small book I didn't recognize. I picked it up. A worn diary with the name Carlo Acutis handwritten on the inside cover. The first page had a quote, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven." Below it was a message that seemed to be written directly to me. "Open your heart, Professor Ricci. Some questions are too important to remain unasked." I sat down heavily in the student chair, the diary clutched in my hands. What was happening? A transfer student with no paperwork who disappeared without a trace. A diary left behind with a message that seemed specifically meant for me. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had slipped out when I wasn't looking. Maybe this was an elaborate prank orchestrated by students tired of my anti-religious stance. But deep down, I knew something extraordinary had occurred. Something I couldn't explain with my carefully constructed rationalist worldview. With trembling hands, I opened the diary again and began to read. The pages contained reflections on faith, joy, suffering, and the value of each moment of life. The entries were dated, the last one from early October 2006. That couldn't be right. That was 12 years ago. When I returned home that evening, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I searched for information about religion, but not any religion. I specifically searched for Carlo Acutis. What I found shook me to my core. Carlo Acutis was a real person, an Italian teenager who had died of leukemia in 2006 at the age of 15. The photographs online matched the face of the boy who had sat in my classroom that afternoon. He had been known for his deep faith, his love for the Eucharist, and his talent for computer programming, which he used to create websites documenting Eucharistic miracles. He was being considered for sainthood by the Catholic Church, with numerous people attributing miraculous events to his intercession after death. I stared at my computer screen in disbelief. It was impossible. I must be losing my mind. There was no way I had conversed with a boy who had died 12 years earlier. If you're finding this story as extraordinary as I did while living through it, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something that challenged your deepest beliefs? Please consider subscribing to our channel to join a community where we explore these profound mysteries of faith and existence together. Unable to sleep, I returned to the diary, reading entry after entry until dawn. Carlo's words were unlike anything I had encountered in my years studying philosophy. There was a clarity, a joyful certainty that contrasted sharply with the cynical intellectualism I had embraced. Sadness is looking at oneself. Happiness is looking at God, he had written, and not I, but God. Not my will, but God's will. Not my desires, but God's desires. Each sentence felt like a direct challenge to the self-centered worldview I had constructed. But the most disturbing entry was dated just weeks before his death. When I die, I will send signs to those who need them most. The hardest hearts need the clearest signs. The next morning, exhausted and confused, I returned to school determined to find a rational explanation. I went to the administration office, asking if they had any record of a transfer student named Carlo Acutis. As expected, they did not. I then inquired about the history of Classroom 3B, wondering if perhaps a student by that name had previously studied there. The secretary looked at me strangely, but agreed to check the archives. She returned with a dusty file. "This is odd," she said. "There was a Carlo Acutis registered at our school briefly in 2006, but he never actually attended classes. He was diagnosed with leukemia just before the school year began and died shortly after." My hands trembled as I took the file. It contained a single photograph, the same face that had looked at me with such compassion the day before. I cancelled my classes that day, claiming illness. In truth, I was experiencing something like a spiritual crisis. Everything I had built my identity around, my rational materialism, my mockery of faith, my intellectual superiority, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of what had happened. If Carlo Acutis had somehow manifested in my classroom, what else might be true that I had summarily dismissed? That afternoon, I found myself doing something I never imagined. I visited the Cathedral of Milan. I didn't pray. I didn't even know how. I simply sat in the back pew, watching the faithful come and go, trying to understand what they experienced that I had spent a lifetime denying. As I sat there, an elderly priest approached and sat beside me. "You look troubled," he said gently. Before I could stop myself, the entire story poured out. My atheism, Carlo's appearance, the diary, my confusion. I expected ridicule or an attempt to convert me in my vulnerable state. Instead, the priest listened silently until I finished. "God meets us where we are," he said finally, "sometimes through extraordinary means. The question isn't whether this experience was real, but what it asks of you now." He gave me his card before leaving. If you want to talk more, my door is always open. Father Giuseppe Bianchi, it read, Spiritual Director, Diocese of Milan. Days passed, and I tried to resume my normal routine, but something had fundamentally changed. I couldn't teach Nietzsche with the same conviction. I couldn't mock my students' faith with the same satisfaction. And most significantly, I couldn't bring myself to enforce the no religious symbols policy. When Isabella came to class wearing a small cross necklace, I said nothing. When Marco quoted a Bible verse in his essay on existentialism, I found myself genuinely considering his perspective rather than dismissing it outright. My students noticed the change. Whispers circulated about what had happened to the infamous atheist professor, but it was Gabriella who finally confronted me directly. After class one day, she approached my desk. "Professor Ricci," she said hesitantly, "may I ask what happened? You seem different." I looked at this young woman, so earnest and authentic in her faith. Faith I had tried to humiliate out of her. Shame washed over me. "Let's just say I've been reconsidering some of my positions," I replied carefully. Gabriella nodded, then reached into her bag and pulled out a book. "I thought you might find this interesting," she said, placing it on my desk. It was a biography of Carlo Acutis. "He's been an inspiration to many young people," she continued. "They call him God's influencer because he used technology to spread his faith." I stared at the book, then at Gabriella. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked. Her answer was simple. "Because last week in class, when you were talking about him, it seemed like you knew him personally." I froze. "What did you say?" My voice barely above a whisper. Gabriella looked confused. "Last Wednesday, you spent almost half the class discussing Carlo Acutis and his philosophy. You seemed different when you talked about him, more passionate than I've ever seen you. Several of us even stayed after to research him." I gripped the edge of my desk for support. "Gabriella, I never mentioned anyone named Carlo Acutis in our class." Now it was her turn to look shocked. "But Professor, you definitely did. Everyone heard you. You even wrote his name on the board and told us about his work with Eucharistic miracles. You said we could learn from his example regardless of our religious beliefs." As Gabriella continued describing a lecture I had no memory of giving, a cold realization washed over me. I had not been hallucinating Carlo's presence in my classroom, but neither had my students seen him as I had. Instead, they had somehow heard me speaking about him, teaching his philosophy, while I was experiencing our one-on-one interaction. Two parallel realities had somehow overlapped in that classroom. "Professor, are you all right? You've gone pale." Gabriella's concerned voice brought me back to the present. "Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for the book. I would very much like to read it." After she left, I collapsed into my chair, my entire understanding of reality unraveling around me. That evening, I finally called the number on Father Giuseppe's card. We arranged to meet at a small cafe near the cathedral, away from curious eyes at my school. Over espresso, I shared the latest development, my students' perception that I had lectured about Carlo while I was experiencing something entirely different. In my 20 years of ministry, I've heard many accounts of spiritual experiences, Father Giuseppe said thoughtfully. Often they're dismissed as hallucinations or wishful thinking, but occasionally they have a quality that suggests something more, particularly when they create ripples that touch others, as yours has. He paused, studying my face. "Tell me, Sophia, what troubles you most about this experience?" I considered his question carefully, that if this is real, if Carlo Acutis somehow manifested in my classroom, then everything I've built my life around is wrong. Everything I've taught my students, everything I've believed about reality, it's all been a lie. The priest nodded, unsurprised by my answer. "The death of certainty is painful," he said. But perhaps what's dying isn't truth itself, but rather a limited conception of it. Perhaps true rationality means being open to dimensions of reality that transcend our current understanding. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small object, placing it on the table between us. It was a rosary, similar to the one I had tried to confiscate from Gabriella. Carlo had a special devotion to the rosary, he explained. He called it the shortest ladder to climb to heaven. I made no move to touch it, still uncomfortable with its religious significance. What am I supposed to do with all this? I asked, my voice betraying my confusion and fear. I can't suddenly become religious. I don't know how. Father Giuseppe smiled gently. No one is asking you to deny your intellect or abandon critical thinking. Faith and reason are not enemies. They're companions on the journey to truth. As for what to do, he gestured toward the rosary. Perhaps start by being open to possibilities you previously dismissed. The rest will follow in its own time. I didn't take the rosary that day, but neither did I reject it outright. A small but significant shift from the woman I had been just a week earlier. Over the following weeks, I immersed myself in learning about Carlo Acutis, reading not only the biography Gabriella had given me, but also exploring his website on Eucharistic miracles. I approached it first as an academic exercise, my scholarly mind looking for inconsistencies or logical flaws. Instead, I found myself increasingly drawn to this young man's extraordinary life and his impact on others. Carlo had been no ordinary teenager. Despite his youth, he had lived with purpose and clarity, using his talents in computer programming to serve others and spread his faith. His compassion for the marginalized, his humility despite his affluent background, and his joy in the face of terminal illness painted a picture of someone who had discovered something authentic and transformative. One particular aspect of Carlo's life kept drawing my attention, his work documenting Eucharistic miracles. As a rationalist, I had dismissed such phenomena without investigation, categorizing them alongside fairy tales and superstition. But Carlo had approached them with both faith and intellectual rigor, compiling scientific analyses alongside historical documentation. I found myself unable to simply dismiss the evidence he had gathered. Some of these events had been studied by skeptical scientists who couldn't provide natural explanations for their findings, such as heart tissue appearing in consecrated hosts with cells that were still living decades after the transformation occurred. The rationalist in me wanted to reject these accounts immediately, but the honest scholar in me recognized that intellectual integrity required at least considering the evidence. 3 weeks after Carlo's appearance in my classroom, something happened that shattered the last of my resistance. I was grading papers late one evening in my apartment when I suddenly felt that same shift in the atmosphere I had experienced before. The air becoming lighter, charged with an almost tangible presence. A familiar fragrance filled the room, and without turning around, I knew. "You're here, aren't you, Carlo?" I said quietly. "Yes, Professor Ricci," came the gentle reply. I turned slowly. He was sitting in the armchair across from my desk, looking exactly as he had that day in my classroom, with the same peaceful smile and kind eyes. "I have so many questions," I said, finding my voice despite my racing heart. Carlo nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here." For the next hour, though time seemed to lose all meaning, we talked. Unlike our first encounter, this conversation felt like a gift rather than a challenge. I asked about death, about what lay beyond, about why he had chosen to appear to me of all people. "Death isn't what you think, professors," he explained. "It's not an end, but a transition. Imagine a baby in the womb, comfortable in the only world it knows. Birth might seem like death to that child, the end of everything familiar. But instead, it's an entry into a larger, more beautiful reality. That's what death is like." I wanted to dismiss this as a comforting fantasy, but the presence before me, a boy who had died yet was somehow conversing with me, made such dismissal impossible. But why me? I asked. Why appear to someone who has spent her life denying the very possibility of your existence? Carlo's answer was simple but profound, because sometimes the people who resist faith most strongly are the ones who hunger for it most deeply. You've spent your life searching for truth, Professor Ricci. You've just been looking in too small a space. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Your intellect is a gift, not an obstacle, but the mind alone cannot grasp all of reality. Just as a telescope cannot capture the full beauty of the night sky, some truths can only be encountered through the heart. Our conversation continued, touching on philosophy, science, the nature of reality, and the meaning of suffering, topics I had taught for years but now saw from a radically different perspective. As our extraordinary conversation drew to a close, I felt a pressing need to ask one final question. Carlo, what do you want from me? Why reveal yourself this way? He smiled, that same gentle smile that had first unsettled me in my classroom. I don't want anything from you, Professor. That's not how love works. I'm here because you needed to see beyond the walls you built around your heart. What you do with that glimpse is entirely up to you. He stood, and I sensed our time was ending. Just remember, it takes more courage to open yourself to mystery than to dismiss it. True rationality isn't afraid of what it cannot immediately explain. Then, with a final smile, he simply wasn't there anymore. No dramatic disappearance, no fading away, just an empty chair and the lingering scent of something I now recognized as sanctity. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years, perhaps decades. When I awoke the next morning, I half expected to dismiss the encounter as a vivid dream born of stress and my recent preoccupation with Carlo's story. But on my desk lay a small silver rosary that had not been there the night before. I approached it cautiously, as if it might burn my fingers, this object that represented everything I had rejected. With trembling hands, I picked it up, feeling its weight, the smoothness of the beads, the intricate detail of the crucifix. Inscribed on the back of the cross were the words, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven, Carlo." No dream could have left such tangible evidence. No hallucination could have manufactured an object with such precise detail. I didn't tell anyone about this second visitation. Not Father Giuseppe, not my students, not even the therapist I briefly considered consulting. Some experiences are too sacred, too personal, to be dissected by others' skepticism or well-meaning analysis. But its impact rippled through every aspect of my life. I began by removing my infamous no religious symbols policy, announcing to my stunned students that I now recognized it as an unnecessary restriction on their personal expression. I revised my curriculum, maintaining our study of atheist philosophers, but now balancing it with thoughtful religious perspectives I had previously excluded. When we discussed the death of God, we now also explored the concept of transcendence in human experience. My colleagues noticed the change, of course. Some were concerned, others curious. When directly questioned, I simply said I was implementing a more balanced approach to philosophical inquiry. It wasn't a lie, merely an incomplete truth. How could I explain that my worldview had been transformed by conversations with a deceased teenage saint? Even in my new openness to the spiritual dimension of existence, I recognized how such a claim would sound to those who hadn't experienced what I had. The Sophia Ricci, who had built her identity on militant atheism, might have been dramatic in her conversion, making a spectacle of her transformation. But the woman I was becoming preferred quiet authenticity to grand declarations. 6 months after my first encounter with Carlo, I made a pilgrimage to Assisi to visit his tomb. It wasn't a journey of devotion exactly. I was still navigating the borders between skepticism and faith, but rather a quest for integration, for making sense of my experience by connecting it to the physical reality of Carlo's life and death. The basilica was crowded with visitors, many of them young people Carlo's age, leaving notes, taking photos, praying by his tomb. I stood at the back, observing, still feeling like an outsider despite everything that had happened. After the crowds thinned, I approached the simple marble marker. I had no prayer to offer, but I did have gratitude. Gratitude for the disruption of my comfortable certainties, for the invitation to a wider vision of reality. As I stood there, a young priest approached, noticing my hesitation. "Is this your first time visiting Carlo's tomb?" he asked kindly. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "He has a special way of reaching people who feel distant from faith," the priest continued. "We've had many visitors who come out of curiosity but leave transformed." Something in his words made me look at him more closely. "Did you know him?" I asked. The priest smiled sadly. "I was his friend. We were in school together before he became ill. Carlo was extraordinary even then, not because he was perfect, but because he lived with such authenticity. His faith wasn't something he did. It was who he was. I found myself sharing parts of my story with this stranger, not the mystical visitations, but my journey from hostile atheism to reluctant openness. The priest listened without judgment. When I finished, he said something that stayed with me. The greatest miracle in Carlo's life wasn't anything supernatural. It was his ordinary, daily yes to love in all circumstances. Perhaps that's the invitation he extends to each of us. Not to have dramatic spiritual experiences, but to say yes to love in our own daily circumstances. We talked for nearly an hour, this young priest and the former atheist professor, about faith and doubt, reason and mystery, the visible world and what might lie beyond. As we parted, he hesitated, then said, "Carlo used to say something that might resonate with you. Our destination is heaven, but we've been given GPS for the journey." He smiled at my puzzled expression. The GPS is the grace that guides us, even when we don't recognize it as such. Returning to Milan, I knew my journey was just beginning. I hadn't experienced a dramatic conversion like Paul on the Damascus Road. I hadn't suddenly embraced all the tenets of Catholicism or any other faith tradition. What I had experienced was more subtle, but no less profound. The crumbling of a wall I had built between intellect and spirit, between questioning and wonder. I began attending Father Giuseppe's discussion group, where people from various backgrounds explored questions of faith and meaning. I started reading not just about Carlo, but about other modern mystics and scientists who found no contradiction between their rational inquiry and their spiritual awareness. I even began, hesitantly and privately, to experiment with prayer, not the rote recitations of my childhood religious education that I had so thoroughly rejected, but simple, honest conversations with whatever or whoever might be listening. "I don't know if you're there," I would say, "and I don't know who exactly you are, but if you are who Carlo says you are, I'm listening now." These weren't prayers of petition or praise, but of openness, of willingness to encounter what might be waiting beyond my limited understanding. Sometimes in these moments, I would feel again that lightness in the air, that sense of presence I had experienced with Carlo. Not a visitation exactly, but a reminder that reality might be richer, more layered than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The most significant change, however, was in my relationship with my students, where once I had seen myself as their intellectual liberator, freeing them from the shackles of religious superstition, I now recognized the arrogance in that stance. These young people were on their own journeys, wrestling with questions of meaning and purpose, just as I was. My role was not to impose my conclusions, whether atheistic or newly spiritual, but to create a space where genuine inquiry could flourish, where both faith and doubt could be explored with intellectual integrity. In practical terms, this meant welcoming diverse perspectives in class discussions, assigning readings from religious philosophers alongside secular ones, and most importantly, treating students' spiritual concerns with the same respect I gave to their intellectual questions. Gabriella Esposito, whose rosary I had nearly confiscated on that fateful day, became something of a bridge between my past and present. One afternoon, she stayed after class to help organize materials for the following day's lecture. "Professor Ricci," she said as we worked, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what happened that day with Carlo Acutis? You never explained." I paused, considering how much to reveal. "Let's just say I had an encounter that challenged everything I thought I knew," I replied carefully. Gabriella nodded thoughtfully. "When my grandmother died, I was angry at God. I couldn't understand why he would take someone so good, someone who had such faith. Then I learned about Carlo, how he faced death with such peace, such certainty. It didn't answer all my questions, but it helped me see that maybe death isn't the end of the story." Her words struck me deeply, not because they were profound in an academic sense, but because they reflected the same journey I was on, albeit from a different starting point. "Gabriella," I said, "would you be willing to tell me more about your faith sometime? Not for a grade or class discussion, just one person to another." Her surprised smile was answer enough. That conversation began a series of lunches where Gabriella and occasionally other students would discuss their spiritual lives with me. I offered no pretense of expertise, quite the opposite. I was the student now, learning about lived faith from these young people who had what I was only beginning to glimpse. It was humbling for someone who had built her career on intellectual superiority, but it was also profoundly liberating. As the school year progressed, word spread about the transformation of Professor Ricci. Some colleagues kept their distance, clearly uncomfortable with what they perceived as my intellectual capitulation. Others were cautiously curious, particularly those who had quietly maintained their own faith while navigating the secular academic environment. The headmaster called me to his office, concerned about complaints from parents, not that I was promoting religion, but that I had abandoned my staunch defense of secular education. "I'm not promoting any particular belief system," I assured him. "I'm simply creating a more balanced academic environment where all perspectives can be critically examined." He seemed skeptical, but relieved that I wasn't planning to turn my philosophy class into religious instruction. "Just maintain academic rigor. Professor Ricci," he warned, "your reputation as a rigorous intellectual is valuable to this institution." I nodded, but inwardly smiled at the irony. True intellectual rigor had led me to question my dogmatic atheism, to consider evidence and experiences I had previously dismissed. The truly closed-minded position had been my former one, not my current openness to mystery. Around Easter of that school year, I experienced another significant moment in my ongoing transformation. I had been studying Carlo's writings on the Eucharist, trying to understand his profound devotion to what seemed to my still skeptical mind a ritual based on magical thinking. "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven," he had written repeatedly. "When we receive communion, we become like magnetic tape that can receive God's signal." I wrestled with these concepts, respecting Carlo's intelligence while struggling to comprehend what such statements might mean beyond poetic metaphor. On an intellectual whim, I decided to attend Easter Mass at the cathedral, not to participate, I told myself, but to observe this ritual that had been so central to Carlo's spiritual life. I sat in the back, watching the ceremony unfold with scholarly detachment. The incense, the ancient Latin phrases, the solemn processions, all seemed like anthropological artifacts, interesting but distant from my reality. But then came the moment of communion. As people processed forward to receive what they believed to be the actual presence of divinity, I observed their faces, the reverence, the anticipation, the peace that came afterward. I recalled Carlo's words about this sacrament, his conviction that it was not symbolic, but an actual encounter with transcendent reality. A peculiar longing arose within me, surprising in its intensity. Not a desire to participate in something I didn't understand or believe, but a hunger for the certainty, the connection these people seemed to experience. For the first time, I could see why someone of Carlo's intelligence might center his life around this ritual. It wasn't ignorance or superstition, it was an encounter with something or someone beyond ordinary experience. I didn't receive communion that day, or for many Sundays afterward, as I continued attending Mass out of growing curiosity rather than conviction. But slowly, the ritual began to speak to me on levels beyond intellectual analysis. The ancient prayers, the community gathered across social and economic divisions, the sacred silence that fell at certain moments, all worked upon me gradually, like water smoothing a stone. My questions didn't disappear. If anything, they multiplied, but they changed in nature from dismissive skepticism to genuine wonder. Could there really be, as Carlo and countless others had testified, a divine presence made tangible in bread and wine? Could the transcendent reality I was beginning to sense actually be encountered through physical elements? Nearly a year after Carlo's appearance in my classroom, I had another visitation. Though different in nature from the previous two. I was at home on a Saturday afternoon, reading a biography of Thomas Merton, when I felt again that shift in the atmosphere, that sense of presence that had become familiar. But this time, when I looked up, I didn't see Carlo. Instead, I saw a woman in her early 60s, her face lined with both sorrow and joy, her eyes filled with a wisdom that reminded me of Carlo's. She didn't speak, but somehow I knew who she was. Carlo's mother, Antonia Salzano. I blinked and the vision was gone, leaving me confused and shaken. Why would I experience a visitation from someone still living? The next day, I searched online for recent news about Carlo's cause for beatification and was stunned to discover that Antonia Salzano was scheduled to speak at a conference in Milan the following weekend. Without fully understanding my own motivations, I registered to attend. The conference was held at a Catholic cultural center near the university. I sat in the back, anonymous among the crowd, as various speakers discussed Carlo's life and legacy. When Antonia took the stage, I felt a jolt of recognition. The same face I had glimpsed in my apartment, though now physically present rather than mystically manifested. She spoke with eloquence and humility about her son, about his extraordinary ordinary life, and about the miracles attributed to his intercession since his death. After the presentation, attendees were invited to meet Antonia at a small reception. I hesitated, unsure what I would say or whether I should say anything at all. How does one tell a mother that her deceased son has been appearing in one's classroom and apartment? As I debated internally, the decision was made for me. Antonia, moving through the crowd, stopped abruptly when her eyes met mine. A look of recognition crossed her face, the same recognition I had felt when seeing her Valisiers Block 6 continued. After the presentation, attendees were invited to meet Antonia at a small reception. I hesitated, unsure what I would say or whether I should say anything at all. How does one tell a mother that her deceased son has been appearing in one's classroom and apartment? As I debated internally, the decision was made for me. Antonia, moving through the crowd, stopped abruptly when her eyes met mine. A look of recognition crossed her face, the same recognition I had felt when seeing her vision in my apartment. She approached me directly, bypassing others waiting to speak with her. "You're the professor," she said quietly, not as a question, but a statement of fact. "The one from Milan who has seen Carlo." I stood frozen, unable to form words. How could she possibly know? She took my hands in hers. her touch warm and reassuring. "Don't be afraid," she continued. "Carlo has mentioned you in my prayers. He said you are on a journey of discovery." Tears formed in my eyes, tears of relief, of confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, that these experiences held meaning beyond my own psychological needs or projections. "I don't understand any of this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Antonia's smile was gentle, reminiscent of her son's. "Understanding comes with time," she replied. "Carlo always said that faith is not about understanding everything at once, but about trusting enough to take the next step." She guided me to a quiet corner away from the crowd, and we talked for nearly an hour. She shared stories of Carlo's childhood, his extraordinary compassion from an early age, his talent with computers, and his deep spiritual awareness that seemed present almost from infancy. I shared my experiences with her son's posthumous appearances, expecting skepticism or at least surprise. Instead, she nodded as if hearing familiar news. "Carlo continues his mission," she said simply. "In life, he used technology to reach people with the message of God's love. In death, he reaches people directly. You're not the first to experience his presence, though your story is certainly unique." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small card with Carlo's photograph. On the back was a prayer for his intercession. "Keep this with you," she said, pressing it into my hand. "Not because you need an intermediary to reach God, you don't, but as a reminder of what you've experienced on days when doubt returns." As we parted, she embraced me like an old friend. "Carlo chose you for a reason," she whispered. "Trust that reason even when you can't see it clearly." That encounter with Antonia anchored my experiences in a new way. What had seemed isolated and personal, perhaps even a product of my own psychological need, was now connected to a larger pattern, a continuing story that extended beyond my individual journey. In the months that followed, I began cautiously sharing parts of my experience with others. First with Father Giuseppe, then with a small circle of trusted colleagues and friends. Their responses varied from fascination to skepticism to concern. But what mattered most was breaking the isolation that had surrounded my spiritual awakening. The former atheist professor was now part of a community of seekers, each on their own journey toward truth that transcended purely materialist explanations. As the second anniversary of Carlo's appearance in my classroom approached, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. After months of study, reflection, and numerous conversations with Father Giuseppe, I chose to be baptized into the Catholic faith. It wasn't a decision made in haste or emotion, but through the same careful intellectual consideration I had once applied to my atheism. I had investigated the historical evidence for Christianity, studied the philosophical arguments for God's existence, and most importantly, reflected deeply on my own experiences. Not just with Carlo, but the gradual awakening to transcendent reality that had followed. My baptism was a quiet affair, attended only by Father Giuseppe Gabriella, who served as my sponsor, and a few close friends who had supported my journey. Afterward, standing in the cathedral courtyard, Gabriella asked the question I knew many were thinking: "Professor Ricci, aren't you concerned about how this will affect your academic reputation? Many of your colleagues still see religion as intellectual surrender." I considered her question carefully before answering. "Gabriella, 2 years ago, I would have agreed with them. I built my identity around a certain kind of intellectual approach that dismissed faith as weakness or delusion. But what I've discovered is that true rationality doesn't mean limiting our understanding to what can be measured in a laboratory. It means following evidence wherever it leads, even when it points to dimensions of reality beyond our current scientific frameworks." I smiled, remembering Carlo's words. Sometimes, the mind needs to be humble enough to recognize that it's not the only path to knowledge. News of my baptism did indeed create waves in academic circles. Several colleagues openly questioned my intellectual credibility. A particularly scathing article appeared in a philosophical journal, citing my conversion as evidence of the emotional vulnerability of even trained intellectuals to religious mythology. There was even a petition from a small group of parents requesting that I be removed from teaching certain courses, arguing that I could no longer objectively present philosophical perspectives critical of religion. The headmaster, to his credit, defended my academic freedom while ensuring that my curriculum remained balanced and rigorous. Professor Ricci continues to teach the full spectrum of philosophical thought, he assured concerned parties. Her personal journey has, if anything, deepened her commitment to thorough intellectual inquiry. The criticism stung, particularly from colleagues whose respect I had valued. But it also liberated me from the fear that had initially kept my experiences private. Once the worst had happened, public ridicule from my peers, and I had survived, what was left to fear? I began speaking more openly about my journey, not proselytizing, but simply sharing honestly when asked. To my surprise, for every colleague who distanced themselves, another engaged with genuine curiosity. "I don't share your conclusions," one fellow professor of philosophy told me, "but I respect the intellectual integrity with which you've approached this transformation. You've given me much to think about." Most surprising were the emails and letters from former students who had silently struggled with their own spiritual questions under my formerly atheistic teaching. "You gave us permission to think beyond materialism," one wrote. "Your journey has validated questions many of us were afraid to ask." 3 years after Carlo first appeared in my classroom, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a conference on faith and reason at the Vatican. The topic was contemporary intellectual conversions, and the organizers had heard of my story through Father Giuseppe's connections. My initial reaction was refusal. I still felt like a novice in matters of faith, hardly qualified to address such an august gathering. But as I considered the invitation, I recognized it as an opportunity to bridge worlds that rarely communicated meaningfully, the academic skepticism I had once embodied and the faith tradition I was now exploring. My presentation, titled "From Nietzsche to Atheist, An Intellectual Journey Beyond Materialism," attempted to articulate the philosophical underpinnings of my transformation without diminishing either the value of critical thought or the reality of transcendent experience. The greatest obstacle to genuine intellectual inquiry, I told the gathered theologians, philosophers, and church leaders, is not skepticism but certainty, whether that certainty manifests as religious fundamentalism or materialist dogmatism. Both close the mind to evidence that challenges existing frameworks. I spoke candidly about my former dismissal of religious experience as psychological projection or neurological misfiring, and how my encounters with Carlo had forced me to reconsider those assumptions. What does it mean for an empiricist when empirical reality itself expands beyond our explanatory models? When we experience phenomena that existing scientific paradigms cannot account for? True rationality doesn't mean rejecting such experiences. It means expanding our frameworks to incorporate them. I concluded with reflections on Carlo himself, not just as the catalyst for my personal transformation, but as a symbol of integration between faith and modernity. Carlo Acutis represents something profound for our technological age. A young person who embraced both digital innovation and ancient sacramental practices, who saw no contradiction between computer programming and Eucharistic adoration. Perhaps this integration offers a model for our fragmented intellectual landscape, where science and spirituality, reason and faith are so often falsely positioned as adversaries rather than complementary paths toward a fuller understanding of reality. The response was overwhelming. Not universal approval, certainly, but engaged, thoughtful discussion that continued long after the formal session ended. Among those who approached me afterward was a prominent neuroscientist who had studied mystical experiences using brain imaging technology. "Your account fascinates me," he said, "not because it contradicts science, but because it invites us to expand our scientific understanding. The brain activity we observe during mystical experiences is unquestionably real. The question is whether it's merely internal, or whether it represents an authentic perception of dimensions beyond ordinary awareness." Our conversation led to an unexpected collaboration, a research project exploring the phenomenology of mystical experience across faith traditions, examining both subjective accounts and neurological correlates. This interdisciplinary work became a second vocation alongside my teaching, allowing me to maintain my commitment to rigorous inquiry while honoring the spiritual dimensions of human experience. 5 years have now passed since Carlo Acutis appeared in my classroom and changed everything. His cause for beatification has advanced. The Church has recognized a miracle attributed to his intercession, the healing of a Brazilian child with a congenital pancreatic condition. I attended the beatification ceremony in Assisi in October 2020, watching with tears as the boy who had once sat in my classroom was officially recognized as Blessed Carlo Acutis. The ceremony was simultaneously foreign to my intellectual background and deeply familiar to my transformed heart, a paradox I have come to recognize as central to the spiritual journey. I still teach philosophy at Liceo Classico Alessandro Manzoni. Though my approach has evolved considerably, my classroom no longer has a no religious symbols policy. Instead, it has become a space where diverse perspectives are genuinely welcomed, where faith and doubt can coexist as companions in the search for truth. I still teach Nietzsche's critique of religion, but now alongside Kierkegaard's defense of faith. I still value critical thinking, but now recognize its limitations when approaching transcendent reality. My colleagues have largely adjusted to my transformation, some with continuing skepticism, others with respectful disagreement, a few with their own cautious spiritual questions. The academic world is changing too, albeit slowly, becoming more open to research that explores the intersection of science, philosophy, and spirituality without predetermined materialist conclusions. Carlo has not appeared to me again as he did in those first vivid encounters, though I occasionally sense his presence in more subtle ways. A familiar fragrance that arises during prayer, a particular quality of light on significant anniversaries, moments of unexpected clarity when wrestling with difficult questions. I no longer need these signs as I once did. They are gifts rather than necessary confirmations. My faith has matured beyond the need for extraordinary experiences, finding sustenance instead in ordinary moments of connection, in the Eucharist that Carlo so loved, in conversations with students and colleagues, in the quiet certainty that reality is far more wonderful and mysterious than my former materialist worldview could ever have imagined. If you've been moved by this story of transformation, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Your own spiritual journey matters, regardless of where you currently stand in relation to faith. What extraordinary encounters have shaped your understanding of reality? What questions are you wrestling with about the relationship between reason and mystery? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Each testimony adds another thread to this beautiful tapestry of human spiritual experience. Remember that wherever you are on your journey, skeptic, seeker, or believer, you're not alone. Together, we can explore these profound dimensions of existence with both intellectual honesty and open hearts. I still have questions, of course. Doubt remains a companion on this journey, though its character has changed from dismissive skepticism to humble recognition of mystery. There are days when my former materialist certainties reassert themselves, when I question whether my experiences with Carlo were truly supernatural or merely products of psychological need and cognitive anomaly. But even on those days, I cannot return to my former closed worldview. Something fundamental has shifted in my understanding of reality, an opening to possibilities beyond what I can explain, measure, or fully comprehend. And in that opening, I have found not the intellectual surrender I once feared, but a more expansive, humble, and ultimately more honest approach to truth. Carlo Acutis once wrote, "Happiness is looking toward God. Sadness is looking toward yourself." In my former life as a militant atheist, I was indeed looking only toward myself, my intellect, my certainties, my sense of superiority over those who believed. The happiness I have discovered is not the facile comfort I once disparaged in believers, but a profound recognition that reality extends beyond my limited perception, that mystery is not weakness but truth, and that love, the kind Carlo embodied in life and somehow continues to manifest beyond death, is the ultimate reality toward which all genuine seeking leads. Whether you are a skeptic as I was, a believer as Carlo was, or somewhere on the journey between, I invite you to consider the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about reality might be due for reconsideration, and that the most rational position might be openness to dimensions of existence beyond our current understanding. Today, when my students ask if I believe in miracles, I tell them about a teenage boy who appeared in a classroom where he had no business being, who knew things he had no way of knowing, and who gradually led a hardened atheist professor toward a reality she had spent her life denying. Whether you call that a miracle or something else, I tell them, depends on your framework. But what matters is not the label, but the willingness to encounter reality as it presents itself, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew. That, perhaps, is Carlo's most enduring legacy in my life. Not just the dramatic visitations or the intellectual reorientation, but the invitation to approach life with both critical thought and open-hearted wonder, never sacrificing one for the other. In that integration of mind and heart, of reason and faith, I have found a fullness of life that I never imagined possible on that rainy November afternoon, when a young saint knocked on my classroom door.